The value of a book. In today's digital social media world with billions of active users uploading on Instagram 95 million photos per day, and on Facebook every day over 300 million photos are uploaded along with 5 billion pieces of content. One asks then, of what value is a book? Books can open the door to ideas, knowledge, understanding, expanding our world, learning about places, people, and especially ourselves. Books give us challenges, experiences, feelings, and inspiration. While we can read on a tablet or phone, there is nothing like being enveloped by the pages of a book. President John Adams stated, "I read my eyes out and can't read half enough. The more one reads, the more one sees we have to read." Dr. Seuss explained it well. You can find magic wherever you look. Sit down and relax. All you need is a book. A home without books is like a tree without birds. Each time you open a book and read it, a tree smiles, knowing there is life after death. What is the value of just one book? President Ronald Reagan stated, "Within the covers of the Bible are the answers for all the problems men face." What is the value of just one book? Nephi kept a record for the learning and profit of my children. What is the value of just one book? President Monson admonishes us to prayerfully study and ponder the Book of Mormon each day. As we do so, we will be in a position to hear the voice of the Spirit, to resist temptation, to overcome doubt and fear, and to receive heaven's help in our lives. Another most important book for each of us is our own book of life, which is a record of one's life, a sum total of one's thoughts and actions. Book of remembrances and records kept on earth and in heaven have been important throughout history since the time of Adam. Of the over 30,000 verses in the Bible, about 250 list pedigrees. That's less than 1% of the Scriptures. The Scriptures offer us stories, parables, learning and spiritual experiences, testimonies, help developing relationships, and Christ-like attributes. We can't imagine the Scriptures without the stories of Nephi building a ship, or without the details of Paul before King Agrippa, or without the story of the faithfulness of Joseph sold into Egypt, and especially without the numerous uplifting spiritual stories of Jesus Christ and so many more. Recently, the New York Times reported the results of a long-term study that showed that the single most important thing you can do for your family may be the simplest of all: develop a strong family narrative. Elder Ballard admonishes all of us to instill in our children and grandchildren the same spirit that drove the footsteps of the pioneers. To strive to do this, Elder Burke Jackson sends a historical story of an ancestor weekly to his family members. It is important to share our memories on Family Search and even audio recordings with the new memory app. Oral histories often fade within 3 generations. Thus, the extreme value of a family history book that contains numerous stories and photos that can be held in your hand, that can present all the values of the book and many values of the Scriptures into something that can be handed down from generation to generation. There are numerous sources in writing a family history book, from Family Search, at bookstores, and online. Let me share my experience in writing a book. If just one idea presented could be incorporated into your book, then the next few minutes will be worthwhile. My story began some 30 years ago when my parents retired and moved close by. I used to sometimes bug them about writing their family histories. For Christmas, they would often find under their tree a journal or a book on writing a history. My father would repeatedly say, as he did a lot of family history and temple work, that his ancestors' lives were a lot more important than his. Then 15 years ago, in December 2002, my father presented to me 3 binders full of pictures and articles from his life. As I gazed at the magnitude of what he had done, I remember saying, "Dad, this is so very wonderful, but you haven't written anything." He replied, "I put this all together for you. It's now up to you to write my history." Less than a month later, tragedy struck as my father died from a car accident, and my mother spent her last 3 years in hospitals and care centers. They had left with dinner in the oven and never returned home again. My father's charge haunted me for years, until finally, 13 years later, in 2015, their history was written. May I offer 4 steps I learned in writing a family history book. First of all, save. President Packard stated, "There is a place to begin. Get a cardboard box." As we cleaned out their home, I tried to save everything I could of historical nature in boxes. The next step is to search. Off and on over the next 4 to 5 years, I'd get briefly motivated about family history, look through the boxes, get totally overwhelmed, and then close the boxes. Finally, after 5 or 6 years, I began to earnestly search through what I had. There were a number of history written by great-grandparents and grandparents on the old, long genealogy paper. I found some short histories my parents had written. I guess my bugging had paid off to some degree. There were booklets that had been written about ancestors, along with a couple of books of family missionary journals. I found numerous pictures of my father's mission. I discovered some unknown journals, my mother's mission journal, along with her father and her mother's mission journals. With all the information I had, I kept feeling the magnitude growing of a work needing to be done to include as many ancestors as possible in one book. I kept also feeling that if I didn't do something, histories might be lost to the next generations. I also realized that I needed to do, as Elder Scott so profoundly later expressed, to set aside things that didn't really matter and do something that will have eternal consequences. I knew I needed to be way more devoted to family history, so from then on I began to computerize all the documents I had. I would read books about our ancestors and search newspapers looking for ancestral information and to gain a sense of the times they lived in. We often visited the last living siblings of my parents. Trips were planned to cemeteries from Nauvoo to Idaho and all over Utah. Also, there was a wonderful trip to England to find and record graves and places of our ancestors. As I gathered more and more information, I knew the next step was to select. To keep interest when reading a book, I felt it important to strive to find a balance between too much and too little. For example, my father had over 3,500 slides, and to be preserved they needed to be sorted and selected. Many slides were of places and events, as at a rose parade with a slide of every float. I saved more slides of family members. Also, fortunately, I discovered the resources of the BYU Family History Library. The Epson slide scanners did a great job digitizing, with the only problem being the scanning time, as it took over a minute per slide. To speed the process, I would not do thumbnails and do the cropping and editing at home. BYU has now a slide scanner that takes only 5 seconds per slide. Totally awesome. The flat screen scanners and Kodak picture scanner work great for the digitizing the many selected photos and articles. There were a number of very tender mercies in completion of the book. One was I had numerous photos from my father's mission, but I had no journal. Then about 2 months before the planned completion date, while going through again a briefcase of my father, I discovered an envelope with his mission journal. I couldn't believe it. I had my mother's mission journal, but no photos that she had written about in her journal. Nothing was known by any relatives. Then just before going to print, my sister in Washington called. We were very emotional as she found in a box in her hay barn our mother's mission photo albums that had been there for 12 years and forgotten about. It was such a tender mercy that the completed stories with pictures of their beloved missions could be told. The last step is to systematize and put the book all together. Of the several computer programs, I used Publisher, as I could easily move photos and text. I created a file for each of my parents' line heritages, their own youth, families, mission, and then after their marriage. Interested cousins could copy which line they wanted. BYU Y Mountain printing in the BYU bookstore was great to work with. The book was printed in black and white, which became a draft with my 2 sisters, 2 uncles, and aunts reviewing it for correctness and spelling. I am so very appreciative of all their advice and support. Doing the book in color at a much wider dimension. Let's look inside the book. Here's a couple of pedigree pages with reference for the rest to Family Search. I soon realized this work was a collaboration of many family members, especially those who had passed on, who wrote the journals and histories, and also those who had preserved them over all the years. This page is from 3 books, including Great Beginnings by my grandmother Davis. Here's from Find My Past, Rock Spring Newspapers, Cemeteries, Family Search. An autobiography by my great-grandmother with pictures saved by my grandmother. A great example of 4-generation collaboration is this enlightening oral history by my grandmother, recorded in 1972 by her son, and then 36 years later transcribed by a great-granddaughter, and finally published by a grandson. An autobiography from a great-grandmother, along with news articles from Salt Lake City and Bolton, England. Ancestors, location, and cemeteries in England. Excerpts of a previously published histories as mission journals of a great-grandfather. I included most of unpublished mission journals. I found when my father was 60, he had written some stories of his younger life. Once as a teen, he was excited to go on Halloween outhouse tipping until one friend fell in the outhouse hole. He had also written a note of several stories he was going to tell, but unfortunately never did. A short autobiography by my mother. Pictures and articles from my father's binders. Father's mission photos and journal. Mother's mission journal. Her precious long-lost photos. Talk given by my mother upon returning from their senior mission. Brief histories of their siblings. Obituaries. Pictures of family heritage keepsake and current possession of family members. My mother was a real old-fashioned homemaker. Included were some 30 of her best recipes. Listing of all the sources. In the back cover, BYU Printing did a CD listing this history book in a PDF format to be easily copied, and also a file with all slides of my father. After the book was completed, I gave a copy to all my children, grandchildren, and all first cousins on both sides. It was greatly appreciated. One should also have Family Search copy the book to be put online as a source for others. There's always more to do, as now I'm using BYU's Canon sheet feeder and KIC scanning machine to copy many of the original sources to pass along to family members. I can honestly say that, as President Nelson states, when our hearts turn to our ancestors, something inside does change, and we do feel part of something greater than ourselves. Recently, at the funeral of a very dear aunt, I again learned the great value of a family history book. Some of the most touching moments in the service were quotations from her own journal and own life history book, as she wrote of her love for others, love for service in the church, and especially love for her Savior. Hopefully you will feel the great value of writing at least one book, your own book, and maybe about other beloved relatives. And also for Christmas, you might consider giving your fast-thumbed social media grandchildren something very important: a cardboard box.